time we're going to get.
Go ahead.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We do have a quorum. This is the Marion Community Equity Task Force meeting for Friday, July 23rd, 2021. Welcome, everyone. I do want to note we have one member who's with us via Zoom, Mr. Milam. And good to have everyone with us. We'll get started. Do we need to take roll call?
Sure.
Or you,
we can. We haven't at past meetings. I have
okay.
Attendance. It's up to you.
All right, you have the attendance. Perfect. Thank you. All right, the first thing on the agenda is the approval of the June 10th, 2021 minutes. Everyone have a chance to review the minutes? Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of the June 10th, 2021 meeting. Any discussion?
I'd like to move amendment to the minutes.
Okay.
At the top of page 3, I guess that's really the third paragraph. I'd like to have it noted that the motion approved, but strike unanimously. And I'll speak to that if I get a second.
Motion here.
Mm-hmm.
Are we that formal about the minutes that we have to do the motion in second?
Well, I mean, do you think there was an error in the minutes? I mean, if there's an error.
So, well, what I would like to say about it, if it's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
I was on virtually through Zoom, and as we know, it was a tough connection, and I kept dropping off, as is noted right there. I was dropped off, and so I actually would have voted against that motion. So I totally get it that it passed, but I just would ask that it not state in the minutes that.
Okay, that's fair.
Is that fair? Mm-hmm. Good. All right, and then I have a second one.
Sorry, just to clarify, seriously, you were not counted in that vote because you were dropped from the meeting. So it was unanimous of the people that were present.
I recognize that, and I understand that that's the case. And the reason I would like it not to say unanimously is just I would like the minutes not to make it sound like that it was unanimous of the task force members, because I was there for the meeting. I just got dropped before the vote.
Okay.
So it's certainly that it passed is perfectly appropriate. But.
Okay. Would it be acceptable to have the minutes reflect that you weren't in the meeting at the time?
It does.
And
it says
well, but that it was unanimously approved by the people who were at the meeting, who were part of the meeting?
Much, I think it's easier to say it was approved. But,
sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, is there a motion to amend the minutes?
I made that motion.
Okay. Well, you made a motion. Well, I guess, yeah, that was to amend.
Yeah.
I would second that.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second to amend the minutes to remove the reference to unanimous approval of the motion regarding dissolving subcommittees. Is there any discussion? Okay. No discussion. All those in favor of the amendment, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. Okay, the motion is approved.
All right, I have a second motion to amend the minutes on the top of page 2 in the second paragraph, where it says Newkirk stated that he wanted this on the agenda as members of the task force communicated. I'd like to say Newkirk stated he wanted this on the agenda as some members of the task force communicated. And I'll speak to it if I get a second.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to amend the reference to Newkirk stated he wanted this on the agenda as members of the task force communicated to say as some members of the task force communicated. Any discussion?
And I would turn to you if it's most member, like I don't know what the appropriate term would be. I just know that not all of us communicated it was done. So whatever you think would be.
I don't think it says all members. Yeah.
We actually communicated that it was not done. So that's why I think it gives the impression that everyone you spoke with said that that issue was done and could be moved on from.
So your actual motion, Cersei, was to add the word some in front. Okay.
Yep.
Just to clarify.
Okay. Any other discussion on that? Okay, we'll vote. All those in favor of the motion to amend, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, please say no. Okay. Any other discussion on the minutes before we vote to approve them as amended? Okay, so now we have amended minutes and we'll vote to approve the amended minutes. All those in favor of approving the amended minutes, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, please say no. The motion is approved. Okay, the next thing on the agenda is a vote to dissolve subcommittees update. Who will be leading that discussion?
Sorry, it was just a quick update. At the last meeting, it was pointed out you did not have quorum for the vote to dissolve. However, there was an error in the system that was tallying it, and I did it manually after the meeting. You did have quorum. The vote did go through. So I just wanted to clarify that for the record.
And so that was approved?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions on that? Steve, go ahead. Yes.
Can you actually vote on something that was never voted on to begin with? There was no motion at all to create subcommittees. This is more of an ad hoc, and ad hocs come and go. It doesn't take any formal action. There was no formal action to create the subcommittee. I'm not sure why you need formal action to dissolve something that was never officially created. That's my opinion and questioning why that formal action took place. I also had communication problems and had to drop off, and I would have challenged that at the time, but I don't see where we're taking formal action on something you just could have stopped doing, and it would have gone away as an ad hoc committee usually does.
Okay. Is there any harm that there was a vote? I mean, it's well taken what you've said, but.
Well, if that's how the council operates in general, but in Robert's rules, that's not how it.
No, I appreciate that, and maybe we didn't need to.
No, you didn't.
I don't. We did, and it indicated the general consensus of the group. And yes, Mr. Newkirk.
Just the perspective on the subcommittees was, and I think that the vote occurred for transparency purposes primarily, as opposed to just canceling something that may have been important to any number of individuals. And it was my recommendation to get rid of the subcommittee simply because you're a small group and you should be talking about this stuff together in very specific ways. And I think it's more effective so that everyone can be heard on these key issues and not have miscommunication between a subcommittee and the main group. And that was my recommendation. And I think the vote just occurred for transparency purposes. And I didn't get the impression anybody was against it, but that was just want to offer that perspective.
Okay. Oh, Joshua, yes, go ahead, sorry.
Yes, thank you. I believe also at that same meeting when we talked about the voting, I also made a statement that I thought I was under the assumption that I could not vote, but Miss Alicia made it clear to me that I was able to vote. And if I would have known then that I was able to vote, I would say that I'm against voting against subcommittees. I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay. Anything else on that topic? Anyone else have any comments or questions on that? Okay, moving on to the consultant's perspective on policing challenges, number 3 on the agenda. And I would just point out that Mr. Newkirk is now leading the discussion of this task force and putting together the agendas, as well as helping us organize how we move forward. So go ahead.
And to add to that, Mr. Mayor, of course, I understand that anyone who wants to put a topic on the agenda simply needs to propose that. I mean, I'm not in any way able to control and manage the agenda or limit what people say in the agenda. People want something on the agenda that I'm unaware of or they'll think is consistent with the group. It's presented to Alicia or Amal and it can be put on the agenda. That's my understanding. That's correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
The only thing I wanted to offer in the, as you recall, was my perspective that you refocus your attention and kind of knock out some of these issues one at a time. We tried to deal with the liaison because I felt that there was substantial agreement from everyone that liaison efforts were successful and working well. I know the chief will address some further questions on that in a few minutes. But then also to deal with the city policy review, and then also to deal with the equitable policing issues that were that are part of this committee's, this task force review. So just what I'm hoping to do between now and the next meeting is I've already met with Chief Kitzmiller a couple of times, met with him again today to kind of get an outline for how his officers engaging policing generally, the training, et cetera, to get some perspective so that we can have this discussion at the next meeting as we've been planning. But also I want to make certain, I was hoping that Lon at some point, and maybe that's not going to work out today, but hopefully at some point between now and the meeting or at the next meeting, or someone could present on some of the challenges that that the law enforcement office faces in terms of providing accountability to officers and things like that. I think it's important to understand civil service rules and some of the other rules that can place limits on what law enforcement can do to create accountability and to in these situations. I think it's important to have that perspective. So hopefully we're going to be able to have continued conversations with the chief between now and the August meeting, and then have on the agenda very specific items to deal with the equitable policing issue, which covers a lot of some of the concerns of the mayor group and also just generally the responsiveness of what people want from the Marion Police Force. And so that's all. I just want to kind of give an update on that and what the plan was for that and where we stood on this time.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Newkirk on that topic? Cersei, you have something? Go ahead.
That was topic 3 about policing challenges. Is that what you just?
Yeah. Is there something more? Go ahead.
No, I'm not sure. We're going to actually talk about policing challenges today?
The only, Lon can certainly give an update on some of the, some of the challenges faced by policing, but I really wanted to, I felt it was more effective to have an equitable policing meeting where all of these issues are dealt with, and this is what the topic's about. There's no side issues of policy issues. There's no side issues of, motions to amend and that kind of thing. And so that's what I've been planning on doing, is having the equitable policing meeting in August and then flowing forward from that. That would be the plan. It was really more of an update on just generally what we've been dealing with and what we need to get information from the chief for the August meeting. That's what it's about.
I was under the impression that we were going to have the conversation. Uncertain about how to engage in that topic because I thought it was going to be a conversation. So I'm hearing you say we're going to do that in August.
I think at the previous meetings we discussed about having this agenda in July, and then the equitable policing discussion was going to be set for August, because we're trying to knock out the liaison issue and then get the city review process so everybody understands what's going on with the city policy review, And of course, as we've discussed before, Circe, clearly the most challenging topic and the one that will be the culmination of this committee's work, of this task force work, will be the equitable policing discussion. And we want to make sure we have a full meeting where we can discuss all pieces of the puzzle. And so if you want a little bit more on the policing challenges, it's generally just trying to have a better understanding of the group of, let me just say this, if the best way I can explain it would be if you, Ms. Stumbo, were in Chief Kitzmiller's shoes right now, you were the chief of police and you believe there were challenges in policing and you believe there were officers that needed accountability, that kind of thing, what would stop you even from making progress because of the civil service rules, because of the union, that sort of thing? It's important to understand those limitations so that as a task force, we can make recommendations that deal with those limitations and understand them, not use them as an excuse, but understand them and move around them. And I just felt that it was more, I only put it, even mentioned on this agenda because I was concerned that Lon had some knowledge, and I know that he is a public knowledge, Lon, that he is going to be leaving for another position, unfortunately. Exactly. And he has a lot of knowledge on that front. So I needed to kind of reassess and maybe have the city attorney or someone else come in and make that presentation on the policing challenges. But that's kind of what I meant by policing challenges. So it's just, you understand, it's like to get people to understand those limitations, but within the context of how do we create equitable policing despite knowledge of those limitations and challenges. And I feel that all should be done together. But if there wants to be some discussion on what that means further, I'm sure Lon could offer some topics and information the chief could too, if that's what you think is appropriate.
So I think it's no surprise that the Marion Alliance for Racial Equity has some things on our agenda that we'd like to talk about, and maybe I'd ask that we then also get to be on the August agenda to present the case around profiling and around board and around liaison. If we're gonna hold off this conversation so that the police department can present, I would ask that we also get to present as well.
Perfectly appropriate.
Yeah, I guess looking at the way we got the agenda structured for this time, the last item we have on there is the August meeting plan, and we just have the generic title, Equitable Policing. But when we get down to that point, I think for the group, we should have a discussion about what pieces we want addressed during the Equitable Policing discussion, because that will really frame up what that meeting is going to look like. I'm happy to, try to impart the knowledge I have of the kind of the environment that police officers operate in and what the city can and can't do on civil service or on the personnel policy or union negotiation side. I'll make sure that if I'm not able to present, that I have somebody who can on those particular topics.
Yeah. Okay. And I think it's probably a good point just to use this particular topic. Well, how about this? I think on topic 6, we're going to talk about the agenda plan. So I think, Circe, then we can list what we think those agenda items should be and what Lon mentions. Does that make sense?
Oh, excuse me. I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Under the policy review, was the civil service looked at, not just from the police department, but also from the fire department as well? The reason for mentioning that is that I know for at least for 30 years, there's been one female that currently is the chief. There obviously is some restrictions on qualifying as far as the ability to maybe carry 85 pounds up a flight of stairs and that, but that seems to have discouraged women, but also people of color has not shown up very well on the fire department as also. The police and the fire department are the face of the city. They are out in the community, both providing first responders in many incidents, and yet we're only looking at the police. So, but I think the common denominator is the civil service to fully understand the rules and things that they are going through. And I understand there are, they do provide restrictions that uphold restrictions that are needed for those two positions, but were we going to have a review of that by any chance?
It was my understanding, you know, when I came in as a consultant to kind of help direct this, and I was taking the information of what the task force had been working on, some of the recommendations by mayor, et cetera. Of course, most of that focus and recommendation was focused on equitable policing issues, not necessarily fire and other safety forms. However, there was a recommendation by mayor, and there's also an independent proposal by the city to review its policies and its procedures, and that could include the civil service. However, I think one of the things that Lon will update us on is the challenges of, can the city do anything about the civil service process whatsoever, even if there are, for example, if you've identified disparate impact for women based on weight restrictions, things that can discourage persons of color regardless of intent. I think those are some of the structural barriers that exist that we need to understand, that the city only has certain authority over certain things, but you know, civil service may be outside that, and other laws may be outside the city's control, but can we still make progress despite that? So I think the discussion on the role of civil service would not exclude the fire department on city personnel generally in the policy review that I think Kirsten and that we're working on as well. But we had been focusing more on the police because of, you know, for a number of reasons, you know, protests, social change, et cetera. And it was a major focus. And I think it was also the focus of mayor. So that's the best I can say. But I think once we get the perspective on what the civil service limitations are and understand that, that will address, I think, some of your concerns. So it's not going to be ignored is the short answer.
Okay, so just to be clear, it's been your plan all along that the discussion on the policing would happen in August.
That's right.
Okay. I mean, you know, there's just to be clear that it wasn't misrepresented or.
And like I say, Mr. Mayor, I understand Ms. Dumbo's confusion in the sense of it's on the agenda. And so I think she may have meant it more as a substantive discussion than merely an update, and we're moving on to August. So I think it just was a confusion issue, but yeah, bottom line is discussing in August, everybody's going to talk about it, and we're going to have all these issues discussed at length. And if it takes more than one meeting, so be it. But, you know, that's, you know, because again, you don't want to limit this important issue just because of time, but the in-depth digging in issue is supposed to occur in August. That was my particular approach.
Okay. Okay, any further questions or discussion on that item? Okay, number 4. Is that Chief Kitzmiller? Go ahead, please.
So I gave you the draft of the mental health liaison policy. So I had explained earlier that when we started this program, we decided we were going to give it 6 months before we even tried to write a policy because it was so new to us, and we wanted to make sure we kind of knew what we were getting ourselves into. I don't think that this one's going to fly for the next year without being changed again, but I did want to take a stab at it because it was the group had asked for it. And I think we've hit some of the high notes. So generally, just to explain kind of how we do our policies, we start off with terminologies and generalities. We go into overview and guidelines, and then we go down to specific procedures. It's difficult if you've ever had to write policies and procedures. You're never going to be able to address every single situation that comes up. So you try your best. Some of it looks a little open-ended, and it's by on purpose because there's so many variables that can play into some of these situations. We wanted to keep it that way. So when you see in here, it talks about a CIT officer. We've got several officers that are trained in crisis intervention. We're trying to implement them into this program as much as we can. Right now, our liaison works she usually starts about 9 o'clock in the morning, and she'll go till 5 or 6 at night. For the policy stake piece of this, the big thing for her is if she's on duty, we wanted to have it initially a co-responder model where she would go with an officer if it's to somebody we haven't dealt with before, just because of the violent aspect. If once she knows them and she's comfortable meeting with them by herself, she'll go by herself. which is what she's been doing. Occasionally, she'll have somebody sit down the street. She'll have an officer sit down the street. She'll go to the door. She carries a radio. If she needs somebody to come help, she can then call the officer. But our concern is not only the safety of the individual that we're dealing with, but also our employees and our liaison as well. Generally, when you're talking about whether or not somebody needs to be committed, it's are they a danger to themselves or are they a danger to others, and can you stabilize them? We're shooting for trying to stabilize them in place where we don't have to have them committed and we don't have to ultimately take them to jail, which would be the last resort. Right now, we just got our last quarterly report from Foundation 2 yesterday. I didn't get it in writing. I got the figures from her. We're still overall about 65 to 70% of the people Brooke's dealing with we're stabilizing in place, which is a good thing. We've got another about 13% that are doing voluntary committals. And we find that to be a win as well, because if people will voluntarily go to the hospital, it means we can't leave them where they're at, but they recognize they've got a problem and they're at least willing to talk to somebody about it. So we look at that as a win. I believe we only still had 2 out of everybody she's dealt with that wound up, we had to take them to jail because we couldn't get them committed. Let's see, again, the overall goal is to stabilize in place. When Brooke's not there, we've got the mobile crisis unit. The mobile crisis units cover a large swath. They're on call. Sometimes it takes a while to get there. We've got something in place for our officers that show up if they can't wait and it's an immediate response. Our officers will go in, but we will try to get a CIT officer if there's one on duty to go with them. And then we get those mobile crisis folks rolling that direction. Again, that goes into when you look at the procedures, the initial response, that kind of talks about that, about contacting the mental health professional or the liaison. The assessment, and again, that's dependent on, can they take care of themselves? Are they a danger to themselves or others? And do we have somebody else that's present, a trusted family member or somebody else that can help take care of them if we do decide that they're okay to leave there in place? I've got the community care committal, the involuntary committal verbiage in there. That's part C of the procedures. Again, that's if we have to involuntarily commit somebody, we will. Generally, that involves us taking them to the hospital. The ER, there's usually a physician either in the ER or one on call that will come in and they will do an assessment while the officer waits. If they decide they're going to keep them, we do some paperwork and we leave. If they decide they're not going to keep them, we will take them and either bring them home or try to convince them to go someplace else. The voluntary committal, again, that's we consider that to be a win as well. If somebody's admitting that they have an issue and they need to talk to somebody, we consider that a win. Again, arrest is a very last resort for us. The reporting process. So we ran into some not trouble, a new frontier with reporting. So because Brooke is a contract employee and she's not an employee of the police department, she can't get access to information that's in NCIC. If we give her that, then we lose the ability to check warrants and run plates and all that stuff through NCIC. So rather than giving her a full report, we just made it the policy in here that if an officer has contact with somebody and she's not there, they'll take the report, print it out, and redact out the NCIC information and give it to her for follow-up. She's very proactive. She's got 2 or 3 people in the community now that she's basically in contact with every day on her own, doing follow-up to make sure that they're taking their meds, that they're getting to their appointments, things like that. On the flip side, she does her own reports that we don't incorporate into our reports. There's some HIPAA laws in place. We don't want to commingle that mental health data and those reports in with our reports. We do make it a point to note in our narrative portion that she was out there and that there is a report available. And that's simply if something would ever have to go to trial, at least when we turn everything over to the prosecutors, they know there's another report out there and they can take whatever steps they need to get that report, and vice versa. She doesn't take any of our reports and incorporate them into her file other than to make note that we were on scene and there's an incident report filed. And the very last thing is anytime we deal with anybody, if it doesn't rise to the level of being like an incident report, we're at least going to generate a field interview card. We put some new notations in our CAD, which is our computer aided dispatch, so we can keep better track of how many people in the community with mental illness that we're dealing with or we're getting called on, to kind of start building that database up. I know that was fast. Is there any questions, concerns? And again, I'm an open book on this thing because this was like a first iteration for me on this policy. But
yes, go ahead, Tom.
I just wanted to add that the chief created this, came up with this policy, even though at the last meeting I thought, you know, we kind of not closed down the mental health liaison, but come to a conclusion that it was doing well. We're going to let it see how it goes, and we'll move on to other topics. But he drafted this because someone from the task force last time who had attended the meeting sent emails asking if there was a policy and if you could please draft one and follow up. And his response is exactly in response to that request. So again, if anyone is, I just want to make sure that I don't remember who that person was who emailed, but that's what his response was. If it was you, sir, but it was in response to that particular request.
Cersei.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for doing this. I hope we have a chance to read it and get back to this at a future task force meeting because it looks like it's quite substantive. I'd like to start at the end. What you just ended with was about data, and so as you're collecting data on the calls and the responses, that sort of thing, are you collecting demographic data of the people
yes.
that they engage with, like race and gender and those sorts of things?
Yes. I asked Foundation too, they keep that data as well. I asked to see, she didn't have it for Brooks, I say Brooke, our mental health liaison this time. I asked to see it because they've got mental health liaisons in several counties now, full time. I wanted to see it for everybody and see what the breakdown was regionally and not just here in Marion, as far as the race and age. A lot of kids, somebody had asked about the SORs and our involvement with them through Brooke. She does deal with them quite a bit. She said more of it at Marion High School with the Marion SOR than Linn-Mar, but there is that interaction there.
Know how they get the data? Is it Brooke's impression of someone's race and gender? Is it a question that's routinely asked? Do you know?
I think it would be assumed. I don't know that it would be asked every time.
It's complicated. So
yeah. Yeah.
But, yeah. Just if we can know, like how both race, ethnicity, and gender are complicated, and so if it's possible to ask people at some point how they identify, we have better data, but it also isn't insignificant to say how they're perceived. Like that's also good data to have. So
I'd like to add that the goal of data tracking also is to continue to assess the need in the community, just in case we need to add more resources.
That's really kind of one of my favorite ones, and I think I alluded to this, that it would be better to have more mental health liaisons and the more data and case we can make, assuming that it appears to be pretty darn effective already and probably could be more useful on hours other than the working day.
We had that discussion with Foundation 2 and Brooke about would it be feasible of trying to fund another spot for the evening shift. They basically, Brooke and Foundation 2 said that the difficulty in that is a lot of the services that Brooke refers people to and facilitates, it's a daytime operation. So having somebody after hours, they didn't think would be any more effective than the mobile crisis units. Again, the flip side of that is they would be here all the time, so they would be a little quicker getting here, but I don't know that we would get access to services. So we did have that discussion and we kind of left it. We were going to talk about it again our next meeting with them, but I was curious about that as well. I don't know, again, with the data that we've gotten so far, if it's feasible to put a second one on the day shift. We'll just have to kind of collect some data and see where we're at.
I think that for me is appropriate. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Turn this way and not seeing everyone.
It's okay.
Just in terms of the role of the task force, I actually think looking at these kinds of data and getting a sense over time about how this different way of engaging in the mission of protecting and serving the community can take place, that's pretty critical. I think that we're looking not just at kind of the technicalities, but really what is it we want out of our police department, our police force, and I will say some of our MAR members are really interested in the notion of peace officers, how we define even the work and the role of the department. And so this is a wonderful way of thinking about how we use our dollars differently as a city. And so I think we need to be thinking, you shouldn't just have to be chasing grants or getting nonprofits to sort of eke out what they can. We should really look at the possibility of reallocating funding. Okay. That would be a potential recommendation the task force might make.
Okay. Mr. Newkirk.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Ms. Stembo said, the concept of how demographics are collected and what limitations might exist. I mean, can you ask someone their race? Can you ask someone their gender? That'd be something that I would include in the limitations on policing issue that maybe the city attorney could address, et cetera, because it's important to understand that. Because again, there's all kinds of, you have perceived data and you have actual data, what people are willing to report as. But again, maybe a limitation what the officers can do is just observe, but it's important for the task force to understand if that's a limitation. And the other part of the limitation would be budgets. For example, you are making a decision of devoting money toward a second liaison officer with given lack of access to resources at night and overtime, et cetera, and expense. How much money should be devoted to that for the gain? That's just a limitation issue and a practical issue that the task force needs to be aware of when it makes recommendations on should we add more liaison, should we do X or Y, et cetera. And that's I'll make sure that maybe that's included in the the challenges facing policing topic, because I think that's appropriate.
Challenges and opportunities. I mean, it's also possible to reorient how funding is being allocated currently. We don't just have to assume the way it's being allocated is the way to go. Anything is over and above that. There are ways that we can, as a city, look at the budgets that we do overall, depending on the mission and vision of our police department.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, anything else on this topic? So Chief, are you looking for input on this?
Yeah, I don't know if we can.
It's in draft form.
I think people need time to review it and think about it.
Oh, I'm not saying today. I'm saying, will it be on a future agenda that people can come back? I think Ms. Stumble asked that.
Would it be a problem if people emailed me individually changes? And then at some point, depending on how many I get, I could bring it back and put it on the agenda again and say, here's the input. Is that a problem if they don't email everybody at once? It's not going to violate Robert's rules or get me thrown in prison.
Well, no, I mean, I think if people have a suggestion or a comment on this, they can email that to you.
Okay.
You can come back with a revised version, or if it's something that you don't think works, you can explain to the group why it doesn't work. And but my question was, you do want input on this?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I also would just, if I could just say, in the spirit of having an open conversation about the tough trouble issues related to things like a mental health liaison, I just want to be clear that from the perspective of MAR, this is an issue related to race, not because there are people of color in the community who are having mental health problems and are creating a problem for the community, but rather because we as a community, kind of as a society, as a nation, have tended to require our police departments to serve mental health functions. So for us, it's getting to what's the purpose of the police department, not that we have some deficiency in our communities of color. And so I just think it's really important to put that out there, because the underlying narrative, if you don't say it, is we've got all of these problems of these people of color who are causing havoc, and the police are having to respond, and we need someone else. And I just want to be clear that that's not the perspective that certainly I bring to the table, and I doubt any of us do. But if we don't say it, we don't disrupt the narrative.
Go ahead, Tom.
I almost completely agree, Ms. Stumbo, and I think that that's part of the reason why I have proposed get to the mental health liaison. It's working, it's useful, it's helpful. That's enough. Because in some ways, by people focusing too much on mental health liaison, it becomes what you fear, which is that this solves all the world's problems. It's all we need to do. And neither the chief nor anyone else has suggested that. But I think the mental health liaison can become this proxy for a solution or a suggestion that it's really the mental health issues of the African-American community that's the problem. And that's clearly not the case. And so that's why I think it's important to, you've got a good solution here. Let's move on to the issues that in my view, really matter and really will affect the community. And so hopefully I just want to make sure that that perspective is offered.
And I don't think anyone has thought of implementing that program with one group in mind. It's applicable to all people in the community.
This Dumbo is talking about a broader public reaction, perception, yeah. And she's correct on that. So sure. I want to make sure we acknowledge that, but also that's when you make sure, as a consultant perspective, I want to make sure you understand that's the only reason why I suggest don't get caught up in the mental health liaison too much, because you'll actually distract yourself, I think, from more effective discussions that really will matter. This is my view.
So as we see the agenda for equitable policing, we'll know whether that's the case, but at the moment, that's the only entry point we've had so far to talk about the purpose of policing. That's why I think it's important we take the chance we have to get this conversation on the table.
Can I add just a small comment? Yeah. Steve. And I don't mean this being sarcastic or anything, but this task force is a well-kept secret. I don't know that the public is that well connected to what's going on here. So I'm not sure we have to be careful about how we craft something until we're ready to present that. We have plenty of time to be able to formulate whatever the outcome is, that we shouldn't be worried about some of the pitfalls that are going to happen now, because I haven't seen enough on the table to make me feel comfortable that we'll have a resolution here shortly. I think from your perspective, you're looking at mid to late fall to kind of cover most of the things that we need to cover and kind of wrap it up and present to the city council. Is that correct?
Everything but the word wrap it up is correct. There will never be a wrap it up, because the data collection for the policing will continue, mental health liaison data collection will continue, the policy review of the city and changes will always continue going forward, but getting to a point of moderate resolution and recommendations to show progress and progressive approaches of the city to be ahead of the curve, then yes, that's what we're trying to get to. And of course, at the end of the day, it's a task force that decides, and everyone else decides whether you want to keep going beyond that or not. But I'm trying to get it to that point of modest.
But the task force isn't here for eternity. There is an end point at some position for that. So that's the point. And it's going to be handed off to someone or something that the city's going to carry on. So we need to get it. So, and I use the term wrap up because it has to be something you physically hand off to somebody else. That point has to come at some time.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Oh, yes. Sorry, Jennifer, go ahead. And
it's okay.
Just want to welcome Jennifer. She joined us a little bit late. So
yes, I apologize. Mechanics, you know.
Oh, no need to apologize. Just want to say welcome.
Okay, so what I wanted to just, when I read this, and I've only just glanced at it, is it really provides, to me, it's seeming like the opportunity to practice what it is that we are hoping to do, which is to have every single policy that is within the city to be looked at through a gender and race lens, and the intersectionality of gender and race together. And so that's, you know, the mental health liaison, I know was a project that the chief has been working on for quite some time, and also looking at other cities and models that they have. And so I see this as an opportunity that it's not necessarily talking about the policing. I think that is an important subject that we need to bring up and have a separate discussion on. But this is really a time where we can start looking at, when something is implemented into the city, are we looking at it through a gender and race lens?
Go ahead, Colette.
Sure. As I was listening to you, Jennifer, great. I want to just ask, as we do this work and use a framework, which is really important for us in the work that we're doing, I'm hopeful we'll be looking at it from an equity perspective that's just more gender and race related. So as you were speaking, I was thinking, they're using a framework to really look at lots of groups of individuals and making sure that our policies and procedures aren't intentionally or unintentionally providing them less than the opportunity that they deserve living in our community. So.
Anyone else?
Which reminds me that a good chunk of our time early on was when Al and Steve were taking time outside of the task force to put together that framework and then shared it with us. And our thought was, that looks pretty cool. One of our processes as a task force would be to take something like this, use that, and together say, how did this play out? So I don't know if that's an exercise that maybe rather than sending you individual notes, might be good for us to do as a task force so that we practice and figure out whether that framework is right, and while at the same time really helping to perfect a pretty nice looking policy.
Yeah, I would just comment and remind us of that. Thank you, Cersei, that if we had the existing framework for how the city operates in terms of its planning, its performance management, what you keep track of, I mean, it goes right down the line of strategic plan, performance management. What kind of data do you collect? How does the HR data plug into the system? Budget trends and benchmarks, those kinds of things there. But more germane to this particular group is we need an equity framework. An equity framework that was part of what we submitted to look at how we can look at this, first of all, just through the lines of law enforcement, but then be able to translate it into whatever the next department the city chooses to, or if they're already there, we'd see where everybody is in a profiled kind of way. Otherwise, getting it piecemeal, frankly, is fragmentation on steroids, and it's hard to keep track. And I think when we have a compelling message that's going to activate the community to get involved, they would benefit most by understanding the framework and how the puzzle fits together. So, so Cersei, thanks for bringing that up. And I think that that's kind of some simultaneous work that, you know, I think we can pay attention to as we move along if it's the will of the group. So.
Go ahead, Tom.
Jennifer, your point's well taken, and Cersei, your point is well taken as well on the gender and regarding the equity lens. One reason why, one approach that I make to these situations, and I've explained this to everyone individually, I think, and as a group, is that the nature of this is that it can become overwhelming when you deal with all issues of every single protected group and you deal with every single equity limit, et cetera. It just becomes a process that actually ends up stopping you before begin. And so, for example, when I had conversations with individuals prior to the first meeting I attended, many people had already said that the equity lens that your subcommittee had kind of worked on and was proposing was absolutely a good idea, was fine with them. So from my perspective, it's like, okay, that looks like it's a good deal. Let's move on and we'll apply that to the policies when the time is right. So don't spend a lot of time discussing it. Again, just for efficiency purposes, knowing the city has limited budgets, knowing you don't want to spend more time with me than you need to. So that's kind of how I was thinking, but I don't want anybody to think we're ignoring that, because I mean, Ms. Stumbo herself had recommended and said, hey, that equity lens is a good thing. And I took that to heart, what she had said earlier. And so you know that it's going to be applied, and then it will be applied in part to the city policy review, of course, but also not so much the review, but also in the going forward, it will be this lens that other people, without having a consultant do it, you apply that lens to policy changes in the future. Hopefully that responds to your concerns as well.
Okay. So is there any action to come out of this, or no? Okay. All right. Anything further than on this discussion? Okay. We're on to number 5, city policy update. I believe that's city manager, correct?
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that I have been working on is going through and identifying the top 10 list of city policies that have, I think, kind of the most potential to create disparate outcomes for different populations in the community. And that'll be one of the last things that I finish up and hand off to Kirsten and Tom to continue to follow up. But when I'm looking at these, I just want everybody to kind of be aware of the foundation of how I'm judging which policies are the top 10 list that I'm sending in. Not that all the policies don't need to be looked at through the lens that we're talking about, but there are some that I think are probably more ripe than others with the potential for bias to creep in or to create unintentional outcomes. And it really comes from 2 different ways. One is that there's something structural about the policy itself, or there's opportunities during the implementation or the administration of the policy for bias to creep in. So for example, one of those policies might be staff evaluations. There's a pretty good amount of data that shows that if you're Black, that how you're evaluated is at a harder standard than someone who is white. And I think when we look at how we do our staff evaluations, how we set our performance goals, the policy itself might actually be fine. But this is where Tom needs time to dig into the practices about how it's actually administered to ensure that everybody has the proper training, the proper mindset, and is working from a process that minimizes the opportunities for those pieces to creep in. The other area that they have is that there's something structural about the policy itself. And since it's come up, I thought maybe I'd at least do a little bit of a primer on Chapter 400, the civil service law for the state of Iowa. Steve brought up firefighters. That's something that I think is a great source of consternation for me, especially given the structure of our department and who leads it, that you would hope that people would see that, and that at the very least we'd have more gender balance in that department. Chapter 400, any city over 8,000 population falls into the realm of civil service. And so if you go back to when it was originally created, I don't know that it was necessarily intended to have some of the consequences that it has. It was designed to drive political patronage out of the civil service hiring process, so that rather than hiring your cousin or your cousin's son, you're actually hiring people that had the proper qualifications to actually do the job. And it used to apply to more city departments, but I think in 2017, the focus was narrowed and it was brought back to just public safety. But in essence, what has to happen, the city appoints a civil service commission. The civil service commission is statutorily limited to 3 members. They are responsible for administering testing anytime the city has either openings or promotions available in those departments. So even the chiefs of both departments are subject to the civil service testing procedure. There's a little bit of flexibility in how you design those at the local level, as far as what you test, what days you test, those types of things, but you still have to be able to get to the underlying requirements. And especially in the case of firefighters, physical requirements are driven actually by the retirement system. The city of Marion is part of, if you're in the police and fire department, you are not part of the Iowa Public Employee Retirement System. You're part of the Municipal Police and Fire Retirement System of Iowa, which only has 47 cities and counties in it. So it's a smaller group and the rules are substantially different as far as once you get in, what your continued physical testing looks like. They're age adjusted a little bit, but it's much more complicated than you might think. And I'll give you an example, and this one is one that I can actually talk about because it went to court, so the records are public. We had an applicant for the fire department who had a medical condition, and the medical condition had flared up within 3 years of them being tested to start on our department. We actually, we really liked them, that we extended them an offer letter. And when they were going through the pre-employment physical, the doctor discovered that they had had a flare-up of that disease within 3 years. And that meant that the retirement system would not cover them. And therefore we were not able to hire that individual. Now, fast forward a couple of years, no flare up within 3 years, eligible to be hired, now a firefighter with another department. So it's weird little idiosyncrasies like that that can actually prevent the city from being able to move forward, and sometimes even hire the best candidates for the position. I think, the intent of the law was not necessarily to create disparate impacts, but I can tell you from my perspective, it's definitely something that has not kept up with the times. Even if you think about where the workforce comes from, now people move all across the nation. It was set up at a time when you put your advertisements in the newspaper and all of your applicants came from within a 20-mile circle. Now you've got people that can see the advertisement online and apply from New Jersey. But unless we're willing to stand the expense to proctor an exam in New Jersey where they have to go through the same tests, if they want to be a candidate, they have to fly here at their own expense to get put on a list that they may get hired off of in the next 2 years. So you can have 44 people come in and test. If the civil service gives you a list of 10, that list is good for a couple of years and you start working your way down that list. So that's just part of the challenge with that particular system. I think, when you look at what it does, it creates impediments to us necessarily being able to hire the best candidates. And the only way it's going to be corrected, that's got to have legislative action at the state level because it springs from Chapter 400 of the state code. On the flip side, coming in through civil service does also provide additional protections for employees. They're hired through the civil service. They can only be dismissed through the civil service as well. So Chief Kitzmiller has some ability to do discipline internally, but when it gets to the point of something like termination, that has to go through the Civil Service Commission. And the Civil Service Commission can make a determination. They can determine that the chief's recommendation was not warranted, that some punishment was warranted, but what he's proposing is too harsh, or they can uphold the recommendation. And even after that, then of course they have the ability to go to court to appeal that decision. We have one case out there right now, again, I can talk about it because it's public, that we just won an appeal on where we terminated an employee for a series of transgressions that were done during the course of a shift. But Civil Service upheld it. They've appealed it once, lost, appealed it, and have lost again. So we don't know where that one will head from there. But even procedurally, there's a special hearing notice that they have to have. There's a process that you have to follow, certain time periods and dates you have to stay within in order to be able to do that correctly. Most of the time, at least in my experience, when something's been overturned related to civil service, it's not been overturned related to substantive grounds. It's been overturned related to procedural grounds, that a procedural error was made and the decision ends up getting reversed. Now, think about the perspective of what does that mean for the department. If it takes you 90 days to do a termination through civil service, you're holding the position open that entire period of time. And then if they appeal, the city has a choice to make. Do you continue to hold that position open? Because if it takes a year and a half for it to work its way through court and you lose, the person has some options. They can get their job back with back pay. They could stay separated with back pay. But it puts the city in a bad spot for trying to decide, do we just hold that position or do we go ahead and hire someone knowing that potentially if we lose this, they could end up getting bumped, and somebody who we brought in, invest a lot of time and effort in, ends up losing their job. Now you layer that together with the public safety departments, both having full union bargaining rights. Regular public employees, that was changed a couple of years ago. So AFSCME and some of the other ones can only bargain wages, but public safety units retain full bargaining rights, which means that they are able to bargain and grieve through their unions. So it's a little different than dealing with just an individual employee. They have the ability to have union representation during any disciplinary voluntary efforts up to and including termination. The union has the option of being able to support legal fees for the employee. And so that's not something that they have to stand on their own. So when the chief is trying to work through, if an officer has crossed the line, he's got to navigate this very narrow path in between civil service and the rights under the union bargaining agreement in order to be able to make that stick. So it's not something that's very easy to be able to do. And that's the broad strokes on how those two pieces fit together. So as we finish up and identify the top 10 policies, we're looking at, as I said, the policies themselves and the practices. I think one of the things I would hope for some assistance from the task force members is, as we look at our hiring processes in particular, how do we reach different populations? What do we need to do differently to ensure that we're reaching all sectors of the community, so that we get the best applicant pools, but also get the applicant pools that are more reflective of everyone that lives in our community as well. That applies to boards and commissions. We need to look at our selection process for that. I would get down to even taking a look within those ones that you can. Does time of day impact the applicant pool that you get? I know for example, the Lynn County Board of Supervisors, I think, meets on Monday mornings. So that's going to limit who can attend. If there's boards and commissions that the time of day that you select has an impact on who can attend, that's worth taking a look at. So I'll be giving that to Tom, but it's not something that, because he's going to have to look at the policy itself, but then also how the policy is implemented or administered, that's not something that's probably going to show up in August. He might have to look more deeply into some of them than others. So I don't know, he may come back to you 3 at a time, he may come back with all 10, but those will be coming back to the task force for review and consideration. We'll hit the big ones first, and then over time, over the next couple of years, HR is already having all of our policies and procedures updated in the personnel side, and then we'll continue to work down through the ones that have lower potential impact from that point forward.
Okay, questions for Lon?
So do you anticipate that HR would be one of those top 10? Like, HR is pretty big. Would it be HR as one of the top 10, or there's going to be a few out of HR that get into the top 10?
There'll be some out of HR that get into the top 10 to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you anticipate, like, one of our interests is that the city departments all be more diverse, welcoming, inclusive, and engaged and respectful? You imagine that would be within one of those policies that you're offering up as some of the top ones?
I think with that, you're probably going to want to dig a little bit into what the city's training expectations are. You know, in 2018, all of the city employees at the time went through implicit bias training, but we haven't followed up for all the new hires, et cetera. So we need to make sure that that becomes part of the annual expectations. Now, that is one of their projects, is to take a look at everyone's expectations for annual training and really revamp that so we can see where the potential gaps are. You know, there's the ones on the personnel side. You know, unfortunately, with the way the world is today, you need to ensure that everybody's getting trained on proper use of email to avoid phishing scams and things like that. So she's taking a pretty holistic look at all of the training expectations and then putting kind of the new track together. So if there are ones that people definitely feel need to be part of that, Kirsten would definitely be interested in knowing.
Yeah, I would say for sure, hiring, promotion, training, and then retention is really kind of the big thing, which is about the environment, climate, culture of the professional workplace. And I don't know where that lands in the policies, but that would be some of the key things I think would be important to talk about.
Mm-hmm. I will say that right now, much like the police software, our HR enterprise software has always been pretty rudimentary. So as part of what she's looking at, I think she's going to be bringing a proposal to the city council to look at our compensation framework, but also look at the HR enterprise software so that we can better track demographics and start putting some of those statistics together.
Cersei, I think Retention would fall under the application of policies, whether they are applied across the board equitably.
Yeah, but like you make the important distinction, there's the formal structure of the policy, and then there's practice. And I'm really almost more talking about the practice. When you start talking about the culture of a workplace, that's much less about policy and more about how do we understand implicit bias, and are people experiencing microaggressions or macroaggressions on the job, and how would we know? And so what kinds of structures and policies do we have to mitigate it, but also what kind of training and support and mechanisms do we have? So it's the intertwining of those.
Mm-hmm.
That still falls, I think, under the design of the HR policies and practice, how the system, when it's created and reviewed for risk bias, would be the plan on how to make sure you don't have gaps in implementation as well.
Yeah, the thing that we really have to watch out for is just, you know, anytime you're dealing with the application of policy, you're dealing with human beings. And so the person who's applying the policy at first needs to have an understanding of where they're at on the continuum of, do they have biases? And if they are, they need to be aware of that and make sure that that's something at the forefront of their mind as they're applying those policies. So that comes down to training, the understanding, as you say, about what implicit bias is, the impacts, the subtle ones that it can have, and then what can we do as a city to structurally ensure that that doesn't creep its way in. I think I iterated to some of you in the room that one of the things that I was talking with a college professor about is he was talking about how their organization really figured out that when they were hiring faculty, that they could see that there was definitely a bias towards the top universities. And so you'd look at applicants that otherwise were equal. One might even have more accomplishments, but if they didn't go to one of the top schools, they'd get discounted. And so they made those blind and just started looking at it. Do you have a PhD? Great, you have a PhD, but you don't know from where. Did the same thing with applicant names, applicant genders, and really made it about the qualifications of the individuals that were coming in the door. So those are the type of things that a city can do structurally to ensure, just as an example, that bias can't creep in.
Other questions or comments for Lon or his discussion? Okay, thanks, Lon. Item number 6 on the agenda is the August meeting plan. Are you, Tommy, you're leading that discussion? Go ahead.
So as I'd indicated, it's not exclusively about the police, it's not exclusively about race, of course, but we're trying to at least deal with this issue. I mean, obviously Mar has raised some issues and the public in general has an interest in this. So we wanted to have one meeting where we talked about what I'm calling equitable policing. And that includes the methodology with how the police engages in policing, how to reduce potential risks of bias, data collection. The mental health liaison can be part of that, of course, if you want to further discuss that. And then these are the issues that I think we should address. But of course, we want to make certain that everyone has a voice in terms of saying this, in our view, is involved in equitable policing. So we can have the discussion. And then you have to decide whether or not, you know, I don't know how much, whether you limit your meetings to an hour or two, or what you do, but you've got to have enough time to have that discussion because it's obviously it's an in-depth issue that people need to be able to talk through. And I'll hopefully have some more information after talking with Chief Kitzmiller between now and then again to kind of make a presentation on that. But I'd be open to other individuals beyond what I've heard in prior discussions, what other individuals believe are important part of equitable policing going forward.
Jennifer, go ahead.
So I just have a question for clarification. So you're saying that in the August meeting, we're going to be discussing the issues of policing, or are we going to be discussing how we can set up a system so that we can have ongoing conversations on equitable policing? So that way it's not just you say your piece or you don't get any other opportunity to say it.
I think you're digging into the equitable policing issues and you discuss it, and one of those things might be we need to have a process in place to ensure that we can have a continuing discussion on this. Maybe you raise an issue that needs to be on the agenda. That's what I mean. It's like, what do we think needs to be done to have a full and robust conversation on equitable policing as it exists in the city of Marion? Obviously, this is not Minneapolis. It's not even Cedar Rapids. It hasn't had those types of events, but we're being proactive and trying to say, given what Chief Kith Miller has already done, how can we take the issue of policing forward to achieve a goal that everyone wants, which is that to ensure that all persons of color and all individuals, however people are policed, whether it's, tough policing or whatever it happens to be, that it's done equitably. And so that I'm policed in the same way as an individual of color. That's really what the goal is, and to ensure that, and so we're trying to get to that point. And that, to me, it includes data collection, includes how policing is done. It includes recognition of bias as a potential risk. It includes discussing how one would assess the data eventually when it comes through. It may include maybe some methods to have discussions, because it can be a difficult topic. So I think that's the way I look at it is, let's get things on the table. And then if we need to have further discussions because something else comes out of that, then that's what you do.
Okay, I want to make sure that there's opportunity, that the community voice is not lost in this. And so that's why when I was hearing this, I just wanted to make sure that this was more, we are talking about what this task force's role is in getting, so that way there is more community engagement and that all of us can be part of that, part of making Marion what we want it to be, that we live, in the city that we live in. So
then I think you put on the agenda the community perspective on equitable policing, and you discuss it, and you say, I want to make sure that that topic is specifically on the agenda, and we talk about what that means, because what that means to you may be different than what it means to Chief Kitzmiller, or you may be exactly on the same page, and it may be different what Mar believes is appropriate. So that's what you do. What's the community perspective, which is maybe different than what, for example, Lon was offering perspective on civil service and limitation. The community perspective on what the chief can do to impose accountability may be an important component to understand. The community thinks he can do whatever the heck he wants, but Lon says you can't. And so that may be an important point. Or the community perspective may be that the policing has this problem or that problem, which may be true or may not be true, but let's have a discussion. So I think including community perspective is a great idea if that's what you're proposing. I think that's the purpose of this topic, is to make certain that this particular agenda is robustly described and that all positions are represented, so there's a full opportunity to discuss those. So that would be one I think it's a great idea to put on the agenda.
I guess with this one too, I'm sorry, Steve. This is one of those topics that I think every community, the issue of policing, when you're talking about race and equity, is the elephant in the room. This is the one that everybody, I think, has been waiting to be able to have the opportunity to talk about. So I want to ensure that when it's on there, if you've got specific items beyond just that would fall under that subset of equitable policing, that we get them on there so that we know we have time to do it. I'd also suggest that this might be one that is worth taking a look at, not having your hard and fast limit for how long you want the meeting to last. Maybe it needs to be a 3-hour meeting for the first session, just so that you can really have the opportunity to dig into some of those issues without running into a deadline and people feeling like they're not necessarily going to have their say. I have a feeling that it's probably going to take several meetings to be able to really get into this and get everybody the opportunity to have their day to be heard when it comes to this. To Jennifer's point, the community perspective, I think, is important. From my view on it, you've got the actual and then the reputational. Marion still continues to this day to have a reputation for being a hard traffic enforcement town. But if you look at the actual statistics compared to our neighbor to the southwest, we're actually, at least for the last several years, have not been as hard on those things as they have been. But we're still, riding that reputation from 20 years ago. So how do we impact that as a community? And for me, understanding what what is reputational and what's actually happening on the ground is an important distinction to make. We also then have to be mindful of how do we influence that reputation? What do we need to do as a department? Statistically, I think there's some data out there from POLCO and the National Citizen Survey about the seismic shift that has taken place in what communities expect of their police departments. Some of it, I think, is driven by COVID, but I think some of it's driven by just national sentiment as well, with the issues that have been raised primarily through the Black Lives Matter movement. And, you know, if you look at what people ask their police departments to do, it's been different. There's definitely been a shift to focus more on community outreach and community and engagement versus doing things like traffic enforcement. And we can provide that data as part of the context for everybody. They're doing another survey this year, and would be interesting to see in a post-COVID world if those attitudes stick or if it kind of shifts back to where it started from. But one of the things I think that probably needs to be discussed here and under that topic is just there's been kind of this subtext of frustration. I think for Mar, I've felt some of it too. It's just about the pacing and how quickly we're actually getting into some of these issues. And I think it's better for this group and healthier for this group to talk about it here and have that discussion buy-in between the members while you're in the room. It's not something that should be played out in the press. I think, you know, as the group engages, we said at the outset that this was one of those things where we wanted to talk about the issues and not necessarily make things about the person or the individual. I mean, I don't know I can't look at every community that's engaging in these across the nation or even across Iowa and say they have the mayor at the table. So he's here. If you've got questions, he's open and accessible. He's honestly the most accessible mayor that of the four that I've had in my time here. So take advantage of that. You know, he's never turned anyone down that wants to bend his ear, even when I've thought he should have. So I think that there are assets here that the group can really capitalize on. I just would encourage it, especially now that we've moved into being able to have in-person meetings, to have those discussions here. So I would like to see that added under the equitable policing.
Oh, yes, Steve, go ahead.
I just want to make sure I have the correct understanding is that the August meeting is only going to be dedicated to that one topic. In the different subgroups underneath that or so. We're not going to throw in anything that's not germane to what we're discussing.
I wouldn't. If I were you, I would. That'll be my plan. But I don't have a vote. But yeah, that'd be my suggestion.
No, that's fine. That would work because this is going to be a lengthy discussion and going beyond the hour, 2 hour meeting or several sessions. We need to keep that in mind. Those folks that are on the task force, to make sure that your calendar is set up to be in attendance, so that we don't have to repeat what we may have discussed the week or the month before in order to make progress.
I would note just a slight addendum to that is that obviously you have to approve the minutes. There's certain rules you have to follow. You guys, that's and so assuming there's no particular vote that has to be fixed or amended, but assuming all that's done, you fix the minutes and you're right into it. Yep.
Cersei.
So I'd like to make sure that when we're talking about equitable policing, that we have racial profiling on the agenda. And I'd like to recommend that we invite Dr. Christopher Barnum from St. Ambrose University to be a speaker. It'd be awesome if it could be August. If not, he's worth hearing from in September. He did studies in Iowa City and Davenport, I know, and other jurisdictions as well, and can talk a lot about what it is and isn't, and how you collect data and how you interpret data on racial profiling. So I think he'd be a great asset for us. And in terms of Citizen Review Board, I would like to suggest that be on the agenda, and that's something where we've got some materials and things we'd love for people to have a chance to look at, which we could send out ahead of time or share and talk through and then talk about at the next meeting, whatever is better for folks. I would request that we get materials ahead of time, not just an agenda, but actual materials, because I'm not at all speaking to this, because I really appreciate you sharing this tonight and that we get to talk about it. So I'm not digging on that, to be transparent, but I can't get 2.5 pages and sit here and make sure I've read and thought about every single thing in the moment. So if we can get things ahead of time, we also do a lot of work to get out to our public to make sure folks have a chance to look at it and give us input as well. And to be true representatives, we kind of need that time. So even a week is tight. The sooner we can get materials, the better. That would be really appreciated. I would say it would be nice to know at some point some of the ground rules about, like, for example, when are we canceling meetings and why? And so I know some of, and just to be transparent, like you put it on the table, I appreciate it, about let's just talk, all right? Let's not let stuff play out in the press. Well, I tried to talk about stuff a couple of meetings ago when I was sitting over here, and I got shut down because I was violating open meeting rules. So we need some agreement that when we're in some of these conversations, that we know how we get the stuff on the table, because if we can't, that's the only other way we have to talk about it.
And I appreciate that, but I just want to make things clear. Meetings weren't canceled. There was one postponed meeting from last week to this week,
which is effectively the same as canceling, because we had people ready to be here.
No, I agree. I mean, I agree. So, but how it's talked about really matters.
Yeah.
So it projects somehow bad intentions or something like that. So if a meeting was postponed, one meeting out of all the meetings we've had, nothing was canceled. And
at least subcommittee was canceled with no notice.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was more than one, and out of the number of meetings we've had, that's kind of a significant number, and it was never told to members of the task force why. It was just a decision that was made.
Okay.
And then we didn't really have a way to ask the question why, because we can't email more than one person at a time,
right,
and we can't bring it up in the meeting.
So maybe we need to clarify how we're gonna. That's
precisely what I would love to have.
Clarify things or make sure everyone's on the same page and that things are explained. You know, we're all on the same side here. I mean, I can't say that enough. We're all on the same side here. We need to see the best in each other. We need to give each other the benefit of the doubt if we're going to have progress and make lasting changes that are for the benefit of everyone in this city. So I would just encourage everyone to keep that in mind. We're on the same side. You know, you can make a phone call. You might not be able to email everyone, but you can make a phone call. You can call me. You can call anyone. As Lon said, I'm very accessible. I've never not returned a call or turned down an opportunity to meet with someone, or if someone has asked for assistance with something or solving an issue, I do my best. And you're certainly welcome to call me with any question you have or any concern you have. And we'll do our best to make sure everyone's on the same page and everyone understands why something's happening, and that we're continuing to move forward. And I think that's kind of the basic ground rules, is that we have to see the best in each other. Go ahead, Tom.
No, it's, I've been making a list of the potential agenda items, and so some of which I think are important, some of which Ms. Stumbo's mentioned. So I've got, data collection is going to be an important issue. The issues that Lon already discussed generally, overview, the limitations on the police, community perspective, reputation, that Jennifer mentioned and that Lon also added to. Mental health liaison, to some extent, I hope we can keep that to a limited, just because I think it distracts from the bigger issues. That's just my opinion. Budgets and limitations, but also leads into some of the issues Ms. Stumbo raised about, to the extent there's flexibility in budgets, how should they be used? Training of the police is one. Methodology of policing, which I'm talking to the chief about, how you go about policing generally. Oversight accountability, whether it's a citizen review or just the general accountability process, it's important to discuss that. Implicit bias fits within training, of course. The other things that were mentioned, like the use of Mr. Barnum as a potential speaker on the profiling, I would suggest that we have enough to cover the first meeting. I'm glad to, I think we should there likely will be more than one meeting on this, is my guess. I doubt if we're solving all the world's issues in August, even with a long meeting. And I think that once the debate comes up about data, how to interpret data, first of all, we don't have the data yet. That's one problem. But to the extent we have some data, if there's an issue of it's being interpreted in a way to defeat the process and Mr. Plummer's perspective would be helpful, then considering bringing him in for that purpose would be good, maybe a good idea. And then materials ahead of time, I would only offer and say, well, I might make a presentation that I would present at that time. It would not be materials, it'd be like a PowerPoint, kind of like offering some perspective on various things. I don't know what materials would be there beyond, if, for example, if the chief has information on data and actual hard data, that might be materials that can be provided. So we'll give some thought to what materials would be relevant and useful that would be, and certainly if they're going to be discussed, if we know in advance, submitting those in advance, I think is perfectly appropriate. And then the last thing was, one other reason why my involvement here was, was also to kind of provide a method for people to communicate with me when they have questions about why isn't this being included? Could it be included? I don't know that I can answer why a meeting was postponed. That would be a city, but still, if one has a question, I have no problem answering and talking to them at all about these various issues, making sure your perspective's heard and included, or recommending that it be on the agenda in some way. So always remember that. But those are my agenda items that I've listed here. It's a lot to cover. It is a lot to cover because each one of these can be its own discussion. There's no question about it. And you guys have to decide that. But I think that's an excellent discussion for August, and we'll get as far as we can, whether it's, I'm sure it's going to be more than an hour, Lon, whether, it needs to be 3. My view is it's better to have 2 meetings than 1 meeting that runs people completely out of gas. It's my view, because but you need to have a robust discussion on these issues and not have time be a reason to cut someone off. I do agree with that.
Yeah, and my point is that any 1 or 2 of those topics could take the entire meeting time. So don't feel constrained that if you hit 6:30 that you're going to cut off discussion if you're almost finished with the topic, and certainly flexibility on being able to have discussions on it on several different meetings. I'm saying I'm 99.99% sure that that's what's going to have to happen with the scope of what you have. I would just volunteer that procedurally too. The system that we use when Alicia puts the agenda together, any materials that are submitted can be linked just like the minutes are. So if you've got something that you want included with the agenda, if it's provided to her ahead of time, it can be posted at least that far ahead of time. And to Cersei's comment about public meetings and open meetings violations, that only happens if a conversation occurs. You can send something one way. It's when someone replies all to the group that you start running into trouble. So if you've got something that you just want to send, you can do a send, but just make it very clear, please do not reply to this email, and you can provide information to the group.
Thank you. I didn't understand that.
Yep.
And the materials ahead of time, other thing is I would recommend if individuals have information that they think is important, if it's community perspective information, there's a survey that's occurred, if there's an article that you think reflects community perspective for Jennifer, for example, or Ms. Stumbo, if you're saying that, look, here's some key information on how to interpret data that I think is important that law enforcement and other groups often miss. Here's a YouTube video of Professor Barnum explaining data requisition. Could you watch it beforehand? I think that's fair game for everybody and can make it much more efficient if people have been educated. And I would just ask everyone here, like, Lon asked that people, everyone asked, if you're going to come to this meeting, put it on your calendar. And if you really can't attend in person, hook it up in Zoom and participate at least. But also to please review the materials that people submit with respect, so that if Ms. Stumbo submits something, or Jennifer does, or I do, that everyone can say, I have looked at it and I've at least understand what you're talking about. So instead of saying, well, I haven't looked at that yet and stuff, I think that's not something we should be doing. Unless, of course, you send voluminous materials the night before, I get that. But if you give people some notice, and if it's important people hear things, Ms. Stumbo and other individuals, send that around just for perspective. I think it's important to do that. So hopefully that's helpful to further our conversation in August.
Yeah, Jennifer's been trying
Oh,
to.
sorry, Jennifer and then Cersei. Okay.
I've just been trying to put this into a practical, like this discussion into like, let's do a practice thing. And that would be, so we're talking about having a meeting that's probably going to be longer. And so are we looking at that through, are we making sure that we're maintaining inclusivity with that? So I can think of one meeting that was running late and somebody said, oh, can we just stick around for another hour and get it done? And it was the two women in the meeting that said, I have to get home to my kids. And I was one of them. And so it was a perfect example of how there is planning that has to be involved. And so making sure that if we are going to be expected to have if we are planning to have a later meeting, making sure that it is on the date that is what's typically scheduled, or is it going to be a different day? And then and the time frame, because I don't want it to get to that situation again where, you know, and it would have been, you know, myself as a female single parent having to leave because I only had, you know, I had a child at home.
Well, Amal, what is the date of the next meeting? What's the date? Or Alicia, sorry.
August 12th.
August 12th?
Sorry, I can't get my mouse to work.
So I think that's a fair point, Jennifer. And so, you know, can people, maybe you have to do a motion for this. I don't know, maybe you don't, but I think that some degree of let's make certain August 12th works and people can commit to a certain amount of time. And if for some reason, I mean, you can't accommodate everyone, and maybe there's only one person, I get that, but unless there's, for some reason, half the group can't make it more than an hour on the 12th, then I think we've got to understand that we're limited to an hour. So let's pick out 3 of these topics and move to September, or that you adjust the date slightly, but do it well in advance. I think I'm available on the 12th, everyone else should be, but is there anyone here who right now would say you'd have challenges attending, let's say, a 2-hour meeting on the 12th that might go, well, I mean, I'm fine coming here later. So, I mean, can you go till 7:30 or 8 o'clock on the 12th if you went that far?
I'll just go on record saying I'm probably not going to make it.
Oh, you can attend by Zoom, actually, a lot of you.
I'm planning to attend remotely. Unfortunately, but I'll be in the meeting remotely.
So maybe it'll be helpful if we walk away today listening to what Jennifer is saying. Very good point, Jennifer. Thank you for that. If we were to say, you know, the meeting's August 12th as scheduled, instead of ending at 6, our goal is to end at 7, understanding, as Lon had noted, maybe at 7, we see we need 10 minutes to finish up whatever that topic is, because we don't want to end it right at that moment, but doing our very best to stick with those 2 hours so folks can participate, be engaged to this really important work, and we don't feel like, you know, we're not being as inclusive as we want to be. So I would certainly be in support of something like that.
That makes perfect sense, and especially if people make a commitment to review any material submitted that may be beforehand, that will also make it more efficient. And then, of course, you can clearly continue the discussion into September meeting as well. So I think that's a great idea. I don't know if you need a motion for that, but I think it's, you know, you okay? Okay.
Unless someone objects, then we can certainly vote on it. But I think if there's a general consensus that
I object because I don't think you can take action on an item that's not listed on the agenda.
Oh, so we can't vote is what you're saying. Yeah. Okay.
So we can publicize in our agenda that it will go 5 to 7 p.m.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I have one last thing about August. I would request that we have a different physical setup so that now that we get to be in person, I would so much rather that there be 4 tables together and we're able to talk more, whatever it looks like.
I think that makes sense. That we can put the tables in the back there in a kind of a square.
That would be awesome.
And we can all be together. Yeah.
Yeah. And
that's a great suggestion, actually.
With the new system, I think we have several of the microphones like the one that Jennifer has that could be used back there. Because if you're going to do it on Zoom, we need to be able to use the sound system.
Oh, okay. So, but it's not going to be in in view of the camera? Is that?
That's just the surface over there, so that can be turned.
Yeah, part of why we're using this setup right now is because of the virtual component.
Okay, so it'll be okay back there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll let you guys, or I'll let staff handle that. Okay. Anything else to add on that topic, the agenda for the next meeting? Any questions? Anyone need anything clarified? Okay.
I will clarify one thing. I'm going to try and get the agenda that I've taken notes on to Alicia and to Amal to get it out as soon as possible. I would ask everyone to remember that there is no way in the world that will remember to cover everything. And there's nothing about the agenda I'm listing that's intended to exclude any topic or hide any topic. It's just a matter of, let's get to this should be more than sufficient to cover in 2 hours and be broad enough to allow us to go down a number of rabbit holes if we think it's appropriate. And then I think you use the next meeting to refine that. If you need to talk about something further, or you didn't cover something or recover something, then you set that for your September meeting. I think that's what you do. So just in terms of laying expectations out there, when you see the agenda, oh, I don't see that specific topic on there, but for example, like budgets to me would include some of the things you were talking about, Ms. Stump, at least from my perspective, or data and equitable policing generally includes perspectives on profiling. Just generally, that's what the whole thing's about. And so that's the only perspective I want to have for the group in terms of when they get the agenda that we'll be using.
Okay.
That's it.
Anything else? Cersei, you had one.
I have a point of information. I know that Anna Clymer, who is our alternate, was on Zoom, and I don't think you all always know that because she's been at every single meeting. Do we know how many members of the public were on Zoom? Is that information we have access to?
Well, there's currently only one, but earlier I did see 3.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can see attendees on there.
Can or we can't?
Can.
On the system that Alicia's using.
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else anyone would like to discuss?
Can I have a minute or two?
Yeah.
Just since this is my last meeting, I did want to say that, Marion in many ways feels like we were maybe a little bit late to the table to start talking about DE&I issues. But this has actually been, these discussions and meeting everybody in the room has kind of been one of the highlights of my time with the city. And I just really hope that the community continues to embrace this work and embrace the activity, even the hard sides of it, the uncomfortable pieces of it, the pieces where you really have to look deep inside yourself to figure out that you're not the perfect person that maybe you really thought that you were. Because I really do think, diversity, equity, and inclusion is the key to success for Iowa, for Lynn County, and for Marion. I think the communities that embrace it and understand it and really thrive on it are the ones in the state that are going to be successful in the future. For better or worse, there are the people that look like me are not having enough babies to fill the jobs that are available out there. And so even at its fundamental issue, economically, the state is going to need people, and of necessity, we shouldn't be focusing just on people that look like me. So I hope that Marion has a bright future as becoming the welcoming and inclusive community that it needs to be.
Thank you for your.
Thank you, Lon. Okay, the meeting is adjourned. Thanks everyone for joining us on a Friday night. Appreciate everyone making the time and for being here, and we'll see you next time.